first question to start off is, what are the biggest reactive PR challenges? So why is this hard? I think most people who work in PR would generally agree that, like, yes, it is better to, be timely. It is better to be relevant. If there is a story breaking that we might be a part of, it would be nice to be in that story. I think we can all agree on that. But there's some stuff that gets in the way at doing this at scale. And I think a great way to start is to kind of talk about those, because we can address those if we bring them to the forefront. So first challenge with a very reactive, quick response PR program is that slow identification causes missed opportunities. So one of the key problems is that if you're monitoring and it takes you a week or 2 weeks to do the monitoring and then produce the report and then deliver the report, well, that story has already passed. So from the get-go, you have to move up your time frame, and you have to get better at monitoring and reporting and doing it at speed. That's number one. Challenge number two is that media monitoring noise obscures the real signal. So you have a signal to noise ratio, right? The signal is that story that you want to know about that you're going to be able to respond to. The noise is everything else. And if you don't have a finely tuned system for minimizing noise and maximizing signal, then it just slows you down because there's a lot of quantity. That's especially true of people in very competitive industries where there's a lot of media coverage, a lot of news coverage. There can potentially be a lot of noise that isn't relevant to you. So that's challenge number two. Challenge number three is that there's a lack of internal process that impedes the quick response. So the issue is that we have to move this story from like person to person to person. Does it have to be approved, our response? Who's going to be the spokesperson? How does this get? We need a quick answer. If the reporter is not responded to within the hour, the story is gone. All of those things challenge our internal process as well. That's challenge number three. Challenge number four is that we have direct competitors and they might dominate the overall conversation. So maybe we're in a situation where we're in a market or an industry where we got bigger competitors than us. Maybe there's some that are even what we'll talk about later, Goliath companies that are just huge companies that no matter what they do, they get covered. So we might have those players in there and they can start to dominate the overall conversation. So that's challenge number four. And last couple of challenges here. Challenge number five. Well, our prepared insights don't add value to the news story. So something breaks, great, we identified it fast, we got it through our system fast, competitors didn't drown us out, but then suddenly what we have to offer doesn't really add that much value. So that becomes a challenge, right? Even if we do the other things right. And then finally, challenge number six, we might have unprepared spokespeople. So maybe this is like an interview. This isn't just like, a quote. This is something more in depth. They can't deliver the message. We're not ready to do it. And you can't really media train, that fast on the specific breaking news. Why? Because it's breaking, right? So you've got to have a certain baseline established. So if we look at those challenges from start to finish, the reason more companies and more PR shops and more, corporate comm shops don't do this really well is that there's a number of things that have to be in sync in this kind of symphony that has to all work together at very high speed. And oh, by the way, everything I just described has to happen maybe like daily. Some industries, multiple times a day. So you might be thinking, oh gosh, this sounds hard. What did I get myself into? But I promise there is an answer to this if we start breaking apart the process and breaking it apart into sort of key process elements. How do we optimize and maximize those elements? Then when you put them together, you actually have a system that can function at very high efficiency, effectiveness, and high speed. And in fact, you can do this on a daily basis and rinse and repeat. So I'll just pause there, Jackson, before I go into sort of how we can solve these problems and make our media response more efficient and impactful. Any comments or questions for the group? I think actually it's super important to define the problem, because once you define the problem and maybe this is the problem that you have at your company or inside your shop, once you define it, you can address it. But if you don't identify it, if you're just like, yeah, we're kind of slowish, it's hard to optimize that. So, and I know Jackson, you work like a ton of this for us with clients as well. So any comments, questions, or just like understanding the nature of the problem, which would allow us to solve it?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that we see that we have to help clients get past very early on in this process is getting comfortable moving quickly, right? I think that frequently it's the case that sort of if you're not used to moving rapidly to approve kind of new messaging on breaking stories, what ends up happening is you just move too slow. So I think that for whatever the reason is, right, it's usually actually more about comfort level than anything else, and it takes some time building trust, not just between us and the client, but also between whoever our point of contact is at the client company and their leadership team, to empower them to move fast in kind of a
it's a little bit the reason it's great. We'll talk about how you prepare some of this in advance. It's one of the first things we'll talk about. And when it's Jackson, it's kind of like a morale killer when like you galvanize everyone. You're like yes, let's jump on this. This is an opportunity. This is great. And like we're moving lightning fast. We're doing it. And then you're like, you responded 4 hours later, and like journalists like, yeah, sorry, that story had to post. Right. So doing something, but yet when you do it, when you do respond quickly, there's all this, and like the competitor was featured in the news, and you just like, stole that story from the competitor. Now you're the feature of that story. Then suddenly everyone's like, man, we got to do more of this, right? I think the other thing it's interesting, Jackson, is here's an example, and maybe for anyone watching, let me know in the chat if you have either received this email or Slack message or sent this email or Slack message, which is, oh my gosh, did you see, like, our competitors were featured in this article? What happened? Where were we? We cannot allow this to happen, right? Like, I don't know, like virtually nod your head if you've either received that message or sent that message to somebody else, right? And so what this actually, yeah, Jackson, go ahead.
I was gonna say, does that sound familiar to the chat? Is that something that you've seen? I think it's something that's sort of endemic within our industry.
Right. So what rapid response PR lets us do is actually say, potentially, actually, yep, great news. We're on top of it. We've already contacted the journalist. We've already, we have 20 other journalists actually in the works on a new version of the story. We'll talk about how that all works later, but it allows you to kind of conquer that very common issue that everyone has faced, and everyone, takes a deep breath and like, oh my God, I just got that email from the CEO. That's not good news. So yeah, it allows you to have a quick twitch response. So let's jump into the next section, which is, can we solve these problems to make our media response more efficient and impactful?
As you jump into that, Ben, sorry to clear momentum there. I have two related questions that I just want to frame up. I know you're going to answer these, but I want to frame them up for us.
Okay.
So MK Hicks says, with the scrappy mentality, how valuable is pre-issue risk identification and official response creation? So basically getting all of the responses built ahead of time versus having the immediate go-to team at hand. And related to that, Stephanie says, we have talented experts in our building. How do we get them into the pipeline in order to be ready for a podcast or an interview or a quote at a moment's notice?
Okay.
So two related questions that I think you're going to get into, but I want to frame those up for you.
Okay, yeah. So I guess for MK and for Stephanie, I'll give you the short answer now, and then I'll give you a little bit of longer answer in the second part of this presentation. So the short answer is that we're actually going to do a tremendous amount of preparation to be very fast. So it's not like either prepare early or be like super fast response. A lot of how you get the fast response is by preparing ahead of time, understanding what types of stories you might be commenting on, and sort of galvanizing the team to be ready. That's number one. Stephanie, number two, in terms of tapping into those experts and everything else, I mean, one of the things that we love to do is we do a ton of media training. We do a ton of sort of speaking training, but we actually, as either part of those things or as its own distinct discipline, like to incorporate sort of rapid response training. So a lot of it is educating lots of different stakeholders, lots of different experts at, the speed that news moves. So, right, like, yeah, if we're waiting like 3 days to respond, probably not going to be in the story, right? So some of the education, some of it is understanding the direction we go. So we have sort of clear principles and sort of how we respond. Three is actually having different stakeholders that might provide obstacles, getting them on board to this. We'll talk about how to do that, whether that's legal, whether that's other entities that are meant to sort of protect against risk, which is a fair point. So we can talk about that as well. So we're going to talk about how you prepare for this. And when you prepare to both questions, you can actually overcome some of those obstacles and be ready. And it's not, it's not a Herculean task. It just takes a little bit of foresight. So let's talk about the definition of rapid response PR. This is my definition, which is it's the process of efficiently monitoring, categorizing, distributing, and responding to breaking news by developing scalable systems that help internal teams meet the needs of time-sensitive journalists. So just to like break that apart, break that down a little bit, there's a process part, which is kind of, we'll talk about this, like sort of monitoring, categorizing, distributing, and responding. So we got to like look at each of those pieces efficiently. We need scalable systems. So this sort of doesn't work if, I don't know, the corporate comms director who is doing this like has to like, miss every meeting in their day and blow off, the presentation they're preparing for the board and all these sorts of things to do this, right? I mean, there could be something that's important enough that rises to that level, but there's a lot of little stuff that happens too. So there has to be a scalable process. Just because we can do this once doesn't mean we can do it 20 times. And then finally, that last part, help internal teams meet the needs of time-sensitive journalists. That's the kind of the business we're in, which is journalists on deadlines need stuff. And if we can give them stuff that is packaged in a way that is useful to them, we get to ride along with it. Our message gets to be included. And what's more, they're going to come to us more readily next time. So a lot of this is creating internal teams and systems to better serve journalists at high speed. And a journalist on deadline, I used to be a journalist. I was a syndicated columnist. I was a radio commentator. Was a contributor on a lot of TV shows. I can tell you, like, when you got a deadline, someone who can help solve your deadline problem is very valuable to you. And so that's what we're trying to do, is create scalable systems to meet the needs of time-sensitive journalists. And we've got to kind of break down this process to make it efficient. I'm going to break down the process for you. So brings us to the rapid response process. So there's 4 pieces to this process as we kind of go through the process. So the first part is monitoring. So we got to know what we're responding to. So typically we have multiple data sources are used to have a comprehensive stream of relevant news. In our agency, we use a cocktail of 12 different sources that we're actually parsing apart and we're using to figure out what we want to respond to. Curation. So once we've done that, maybe in a more automated fashion, then we need someone to go through and curate those automated matches to find stories that can be leveraged by the team. Right? That's step 2. Step 3 is response. So then we've actually got to respond to the journalist, right? We've identified the one that's a good candidate for response. Now we've got to respond to them in real time with a new angle for the story. And then finally, we need to amplify that. So maybe we take that story, respond to the journalist, but that's a pretty good story idea. We take it and we pitch 20 other lookalike journalists with a version of the story that now maybe removes our competitor, frames it in a way that's more favorable to us, and then pitches that out with us as the kind of the featured source or expert. So monitoring, curation, response, amplification. So when we look at this, let me show you more of what this looks like from a process point of view. So here are 3 very common types of rapid response. First type is competitor and partner response. So if your competitors are making news, if your partners, maybe you work with them, they're making news, you could be a part of those stories. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about related company response and how can we look at companies that are neither competitors nor partners, but they sort of play in our space, right? How do we leverage the news they create and respond quickly? And then third is topical response. So maybe it's not a competitor or partner, maybe it's not a related company, but there's a certain topic that we want to own. Maybe that's the topic that's some of like our SEO keywords we want to own. Maybe that's just like, we're moving into a new market or a new industry, and this is the thing that like we've got to anchor to. So if those topics are mentioned, we want to respond to it, right? So 3 types of rapid response. And let's kind of do a thought experiment, and I'll kind of break down 3 models for doing each of these 3 things. So the first model to deal with competitors and also partners is called the slingshot. And what you see in the graphic there is we see a spaceship going around the moon or a planet, and it's accelerating. It's getting bigger. It's getting faster as a result of going around that planet. And this is what we want to do with competitors. So this is, if you're a movie buff, by the way, this is how Matt Damon gets home in the movie The Martian. You're a Matt Damon fan. or it's how Tom Hanks in Apollo 13 gets back, right? So it's actually I'm dropping knowledge here. This is astrophysics here, but it's really useful for us. So what we want to do is slingshot around competitor news in a couple different ways. First, by doing a competitive search of all of their coverage, very common for us is the past 12 months, and then map that coverage to a list of contacts we can contact. So first thing we're trying to do is actually get from the beginning, here, just this here, get from the beginning a background, a list of where has our competitor been and how can we leverage that? That's number one. Number two is that we want to do this on an ongoing basis. So how can we monitor competitor hits in real time and then pitch stories about our brand to make sure we're part of the conversation? So that's called the slingshot. And if you do this properly, then anytime a competitor gets mentioned, great news for you, because they've just done half of the work to get you a media placement too by showing you who's going to cover your story. Okay, so that's the slingshot. Second one we call the Goliath. This is for related companies. And this is how to use large Goliath companies in your industry to raise your profile. So what's that? You could be a big brand, but there's bigger brands, right? You could be a big company, but there's bigger companies. Or you could be a medium-sized or a small company or just a startup trying to make its way, disrupting a huge industry with huge players. The point is that if people are more newsworthy than you and generate more news than you, that's great. Leverage OPN, other people's news. And so to do that, you start tracking and monitoring those who create a lot of news. So here's a great example of that. A client of ours is a marketplace for used gadgets where you can sell your old iPhone when a new iPhone comes out. So we will monitor Apple. And when there is news coming up that Apple makes, we will rapid respond and pitch our client to be part of that conversation. The great thing about Apple as well is Apple is actually, they'll plan a lot of news. We know when there's going to be a big announcement coming up. We know generally when there's a new iPhone coming out. So we can look ahead and actually start pitching them 3 weeks in advance as rapid response when no one else has any other information and we're planned. And then when Apple news actually comes out, be part of all of those stories with commentary on top of it. So that is the Goliath. Third is the news jack. So this is the trending topic, the keyword terms that we're monitoring. And we know typically on a news jack that usually there's an initial wave of a story, if it's a pretty big story, maybe first 24 to 48 hours. And then there might be, if it's a big enough story, analysis of the story, implications of the story, a second wave of the story that all come. So for the news jack, how can we be fast enough when a story breaks to be in the original story, not just the follow-up to the story? And we'll talk about that. So here is a schematic for rapid response in action. Step one, the news opportunity is identified. So we might have a person assigned just to monitor and flag news opportunities. But then it passes to step number two, second person, let's say, who is immediately pitching the reporter of that initial story, our angle or our unique approach or our unique insight or our unique data or our unique case study that provides value. So we got the first step or person, identifying the opportunity, passing it to the second person who is responding to that journalist. And then third, there's a third person who says, let's take this story. This has implications to other journalists, and let's now target other journalists, look-alike journalists, who maybe haven't seen or thought of the story yet, if it's a story that's like more niche, or it can be a big, huge story that's in the news, and we've got a unique angle that just hasn't been covered, right? Might even be different than what we pitched to journalists in step two, and then let's go out to journalists and let's amplify this further. Okay, so it's this dance of 1, 2, 3. We often do it with 3 different people moving in coordination, and that allows you to be really, really responsive and really, really fast. So that's the mechanism of rapid response, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. So let's talk about how does rapid response PR help solve some of the biggest pain points we identified. But Jackson, before I do that, that's kind of the foundation, just to make sure everyone's on the page and understands what rapid response is. Does that make sense to everyone? Does that make sense to you, what we're doing? We're monitoring things. we're curating things, we're responding to things, and then we're amplifying things further. And we're doing this in a coordinated process. So typically, we'll talk about why it's important. It's much easier to not do this with like one person doing all those steps, right? It's going to take your entire day. So there's some specialization that happens that makes this a little bit better. But any questions or comments on just understanding what rapid response PR is and this sort of conception, this version of it?
I think that we are following what it is. There were a couple of executional questions that I think might be helpful to kind of have in mind as we move forward, though.
Okay, sure.
The first is, you know, I have experts, right? I have people who have a lot of knowledge in my field. So in this case, you know, Stephanie's asking about you know, the health technology field. But if I have experts who don't have a long track record in the media, how do I get journalists to recognize their expertise and their authority to comment on a story that's breaking?
Okay, great question. One really fast way to do it is actually, we do a whole presentation on this, the power of data. So if you're not going to use their credential, right, you know, as your thing, right? Like this is, you know, I don't know, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, right, on infectious disease, recognized expert, probably can be pitched just on credentials, right? All over the news already. But if it's not that, then let's build up the credential fast with something else. So one of the fastest ways to do it is actually with a data program that has some ownable bits of data that you can use to establish credibility. That's one. Second one is actually responsiveness to the story itself, and an actually good insight establishes credibility. What I mean by that is just like, if you don't know anything about an expert, but they give you something that really makes sense, it kind of supports their expertise, right? So we actually craft insights for experts that have three characteristics: simple, surprising, and significant. You've heard me say this before, Jackson. Sorry, right? So simple, you got to be able to understand it quick, right? You don't have a lot of time for journalist attention. Surprising, this is the part that trips people up. We can't just give the general wisdom, right? We can't just give what everyone else is saying and kind of the journalist is like, well, duh, right? It's like, okay, you might do the duh quote if it's like the person's really important, right? Or you know them, right? You're like, okay, they're, but if you don't know and you're trying to establish expertise, you got to do something surprising, but it still makes sense. And then finally, significant is the third thing. So you need simple, surprising, and significant insights that you can convey. And even the act of the advice or the insight will convey expertise. Was there a second question, Jackson?
There is a second question coming in from MK. Sort of acknowledging, Ben, that we need to move quickly, but we kind of need to keep it inside the guardrails, right? We need to be on message. What's the best way kind of internally to govern that? Is it establishing a set of guidelines and a guardrails document, or is it actually having a gatekeeper and saying there's an approval process and you need to have everything approved by, you know, a person or a handful of people? What do you find is the best way to handle that?
Sure, and we're gonna talk about it, but let me give you the short answer, which is that number one, it's great, MK, to have pre-approved answers that don't require approval or vetting. It just allows you to be faster. You can do that in certain areas that you know are going to come up a lot. We're going to talk about how you assess that. But then two, I think it does have, you know, like ideally, it's kind of like I don't know, the bat phone from Batman or the symbol in the sky, right? It's like if we're in rapid response mode and everyone knows what rapid response mode means, it means we have to move quickly. And there could be a point of approval to do something, or like, let's say the expert quote and the point of approval. But in general, what I like to do is move things as much to pre-approved as we can. And then if there's little tweaks, what's nice is if things are pre-approved and then you tweak it, you know, with a couple of changes, it's kind of already pre-approved. It gets it easier to get that change one approved, right? It's like 90% of this is the same. We just did ABC as different. And then finally, some of the guardrails, I mean, having those be clear up front and show that you understand them gives you credibility. So an example of this, and I don't know, maybe MK and Steffi, you can tell me if you're at a big company, small company, or you're at an agency, like let me know about your situation, like put it in the chat. But one of the things that is important is you have more credibility if you kind of know what are the guardrails and understand what can be approved quickly and what cannot. So for instance, we have a number of clients in healthcare, big insurance companies. And I can tell you some of the guardrails for a couple of them is like, we don't comment on politics, right? So if we go into a rapid response process, we're like, yeah, we're trying to get you to approve this like opinion on, you know, the 2 presidential candidates and what's going on there, and there's an opportunity, and it's like, yeah, we're not wading into politics. We're not even entering that. We know that's a guardrail, right? So it's also, it builds trust over time when you sort of like can demonstrate like that, you know, the difference between things we can comment on and things we can't. So that being said, let's move on to how does rapid response PR solve our biggest content pain points, and then we're going to kind of get into best practices. So first thing to kind of realize about this method we've outlined is that rapid response PR provides you with news. This is kind of obvious, but there is a consistent stream of stories you can leverage, and that has maybe less than obvious implications. So if you're a PR shop, or if you have hired agencies for, you know, your department or division doing this, one of the pain points that I sometimes hear quite a lot about is they say, like the PR team will come and say, hey, we don't have anything to pitch. Like, we don't have any news. You got any news? You got any news for us? You got a new feature? You got a splashy hire? Did you raise some money? What else you got? We need something. So when you implement a rapid response program, there is a consistent stream of stories you can leverage. There are no excuses anymore of like, we don't have news. There's a plethora of things you can piggyback on if you do this right. That's number one, how it helps you. Number two is that by its nature, it makes you timely and relevant. So even really experienced PR professionals, the issue is that when there's a lot of investment of effort, sometimes you're less than timely and relevant. Here's a classic example. We just did this big white paper. We just did this big data study. We just did this big annual report. And once we do that, we always want to release it. We're often not like, oh yeah, there was this breaking story that would be perfect that our report can add insight to, right? We're just trying to like sort of get it out there often. So by thinking in this rapid response way, you are always thinking about what's timely and relevant, and you become more important to the industry or the cultural conversation. And so I actually find that rapid response PR gives a whole new life to like all of that content marketing you did, that data study, that white paper, because all of that stuff can be applied to the situation and it gives it new life and new relevance. So if you're doing rapid response PR, you're going to be the best friend of the content marketing team. And if you're doing content marketing and you're not also doing rapid response PR, you're missing out on a huge opportunity, because all of that sort of content you're generating has a new, timely, and relevant application if you follow this process. Number three, rapid response PR establishes share of mind. This is something that's really important to us, that like a lot of you maybe may deal with share of voice, right? So what share of voice is if you have a pie of all of the coverage of, let's say, a topic or an industry, what is your slice of the pie? But there's something equally as important that a lot of people don't focus on, which is a share of mind. And that's share of mind with the journalists who are covering the story. So let's say there's 1,000 journalists who really matter to our coverage. Share of mind refers to how many of those journalists know who we are as a brand. Then one step further, how many of those journalists know who we are, but then have a positive, can describe what we do. Then it's like, well, do they know who we are? Can they describe what we do? But then they have a positive impression about us. Then once they have a positive impression, how many of them will readily accept pitches and communications? Then who will be a conduit for more news? So share of mind is hugely important. And what rapid response PR does is it allows you to dramatically improve your brand's awareness with journalists, because you just get a lot of touch points. There's a lot of ways that you have a reason to contact, and it's a high value reason. It's a reason for their benefit, not just your benefit. Number four, rapid response PR helps develop relationships. So it helps demonstrate timely value, which gives you multiple reasons to interact. So that's hugely, hugely important. So what it allows you to do is that if you believe in relationships, for PR, as you should, being relevant and timely repeatedly and adding a value, it's a pretty good way to develop a relationship. I mean, here's your relationship options. You can be like, yeah, we were childhood friends. We have a relationship. Yep, we went to, the same alma mater, we're in the same college. Okay, that helps with the relationship. Yep, we got some shared experience, right? We're both, we both got young kids. We both live in the same area. Those are all ways to build relationships. Now, that if you have that, leverage that, right? But if you want to do this across lots of different stories all over the world, you might not always have that. So these timely responses, adding value, actually really helps you develop relationships because you have a repeat reason to interact multiple times. Number 5, it accelerates internal process. I think this is important for sort of MK. You're kind of talking about this. Well, I've seen this again and again where like there's lots of barriers from stakeholders, like legal's got this issue, you know, executive team has this issue, brand team has this issue, like all these issues, right, that slow us down. But when we start being like, we're developing a rapid response program, by its very name, people get like, we got to be quick. We align multiple stakeholders in removing some of the barriers because there's clear benefit to us. So it actually does help improve and accelerate internal process. Number 6, it gives competitive advantage. So you can easily piggyback on and leapfrog what your rivals do. As I mentioned earlier, like, great, competitor A was mentioned, we're gonna one-up them. Great, competitor B was, and C and D were featured in the roundup. We weren't, not gonna happen next time, right? There's a path forward to leverage everything they do, and that breeds a lot of confidence also in your team, in the organization. And often if you're someone that wants people to invest more in PR, they often do when they see how you can leverage that for competitive advantage. And finally, I don't want to overlook this before we get into best practices, which is number 7. The 7th reason that sort of it helps you rapid response PR is that it positions your brand. Because when you're quick, when you're timely, when you're relevant, that impacts your brand perception. And you know, what do brands want to be? I don't know too many companies that don't want to be perceived as, you know, quick and responsive, that don't want to be perceived as cutting edge. That all of those things are usually things that helps the perception of your brand. So when you do this well, you're doing this with, you know, frontline journalists who are going to cover you. You show how well your brand, your company, your team, you are put together, and that helps position your brand. So we're going to jump over to what does a rapid response program actually look like? I'm going to show you some case studies, and I want to give you kind of a B2B one and a B2C one, show you on both sides of this, how this works. And then we're going to talk about kind of 6 or 7 best practices so you can implement this tomorrow. So Jackson, before I go on, any other questions? I love MK. I love Stephanie for asking. Is there anyone else that has a question, or are MK and Stephanie continuing to be prolific here?
I think right now we're all set for questions. Although kind of as we get more into the nitty gritty of what the program actually looks like, I expect we're going to have a lot more questions in terms of how to structure these programs, kind of what your learnings have been, Ben, as you've established rapid response programs at dozens of companies that you've worked with. So I'm sure that those insights are going to be valuable, and I'm sure that the questions are going to come rolling in. So as you have them, chat, please share them with us, and we'll make sure that Ben hears them and answers.
Yep. So sounds good. I'm going to give you some examples now, and then we're going to talk about best practices. And then the other thing to know is that, you know, we do this. We have a training program on this. So if this is something that you want to implement on your own, we have a kind of a full day and a half day training program that would be happy to go more in depth in your situation. And we do this for a lot of companies and brands too. So we also can help set this up, do this for you for 6 months and hand it off to your internal team, or keep doing it. We do this all over the world in multiple languages, 20+ countries, and I'll talk about how that works internationally. So with that being said, let's look at what does a rapid response program actually look like. And I want to show you this example. So this is from one of our clients, a cybersecurity company, and this is the headline that actually the first headline we placed, which was in CNBC, cyber attacks are an immediate challenge for businesses following Iran strike. And let me take you through the generation of that headline and how rapid response was the key. So in the morning, step 1, you can see at the bottom, if you can see my cursor at the bottom, kind of lower left-hand corner, our team identified the CNBC Iran conflict story as a possible rapid response candidate. Now, the first version of this, before the headline you see, actually just talked about the conflict with Iran at the time, and how there could be cyber attacks against the US government. Our client doesn't really do government cyber attack stuff. They do corporate cyber attack prevention. So we saw a story, our team flagged it because, hey, this is related. They ran a story related to governments and cybersecurity related to the Iran conflict, geopolitical crisis. Let's pitch another story. So that's what happens by that afternoon. So we flag it automatically. Someone curates it, identifies this as a good candidate, and then by afternoon, the step 2 down below, on the bottom of your screen in the middle, our team is calling and emailing the CNBC reporter who wrote the Iran story to pitch a new angle on the business impact. And then by day 2, which is step number 3, CNBC runs a news story, which is the headline you see, highlighting the business risk and featuring client as the main expert source. So now they're saying, yeah, there's a risk to businesses, not just governments, which is exactly the story we want. And our client is really the entire source for this entire story. So it's all really about their insights, their best practices, their implications, their predictions. Okay, so that's kind of part 1. And that all happens, you can see, in a span of 2 days. Then what actually happens is on day 3, which is step 4, our team repackages the CNBC story to now pitch 20 more lookalike top-tier journalists who cover Iran. So now we're looking and saying, hey, this kind of story worked out well. Now let's pitch other lookalike journalists to the reporter who covered it. And then by day 4, which is the 5th step there in the middle, NPR's Morning Edition, flagship show for NPR, expresses interest in running the story. And then by the 5th day, it actually airs on NPR. It's the headline you see there, which is Iran conflict could shift to cyberspace, experts warn. And it's posted online, and it's syndicated to 250 NPR affiliates nationwide. So just to, again, go back, we go through from flagging this story, immediately pitching the journalist, getting the placement in CNBC, then going to broader numbers of journalists, identifying one who covers Iran that would be interested in Morning Edition, and then they run the story and it goes across their entire network. So that's in action. That's a B2B cybersecurity company. And then you might be thinking, well, I get that this works for cybersecurity. And by the way, we have a number of cybersecurity clients, so this works fantastic for cybersecurity. But then once we do that, let's look at a totally different example on a B2C company in a totally different arena and a totally different area to see how this works. So that is a client of ours called Ambronite. Ambronite makes kind of like sort of hot, like full nutrition meal replacement sort of shakes, but they use whole foods and whole ingredients to give you like 100% of your daily kind of nutrient needs. So what we realized was that it's kind of like Soylent, which is a well-known rival and competitor, but because Ambronite is doing this with whole foods, not powders, right? So they want to, at this time, they were unknown. They wanted to break into the market. They wanted to do pre-sales to raise funds and do a crowdfunding campaign to sell more. And so one of the keys is I wanted to show you that, we did many different tactics for them, but actually rapid response PR was the most important. And so here's what we did. So basically, we used our rapid response PR process. We searched for journalists who had covered Soylent in the past and any new Soylent mentions as they were coming up. And then we were pitching stories in real time as we found new people covering Soylent that highlighted Ambronite's different approach. So here are some of the headlines that resulted. You could see how this is slingshotting around a competitor, Soylent. Like Time Magazine's running, Soylent has some competition, and we taste tested it. Wired Magazine's running, premium Soylent rival fuels the food drink revolution. We love that because it's like Soylent, but it's like we're premium, we're better. And then US News and World Report is running Meals of the Future. Will Soylent and Ambronite make food obsolete? That's awesome because Soylent is very well capitalized, much more well known, and we're happy to be side by side with them all day long. And so what actually happened from this is this rapid response process generated in a short amount of time, I mean, over the process, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks, 150 media hits, 8,000 media kind of social shares of those media hits, placements in Time, Wired, Forbes, dozens of top tier publications, PR value, if you're looking at ad equivalency, no, it's a little bit of a fuzzy metric, but if you're looking at that of over $1 million, and all of that created huge inbound links, which rocketed them up SEO, which generated a lot more sales because they were generating so many links in such a short time, and which actually is related to next week's webinar, which is on scalable link building. So we were doing scalable link building for them too. And then they exceeded their overall sales goal and their crowdfunding goal by more than 200% in even less time than they expected. So all of that is the power. So in one case, we've seen cybersecurity. In another case, we've seen a consumer product that isn't well known, but it speaks to the power of rapid response PR. So let me end on kind of the most important thoughts of the day, which are, what are the best practices for rapid response PR? What can you do today, tomorrow, this week, next month to really put this into practice? And then I'm happy to answer any questions and also be a resource. I'll give you my email and you can contact me. We're happy to offer advice informally, consult formally, or also do trainings or just run this program for you. So what are best practices for rapid response PR? Number one is separate key team functions. Having some degree of specialization in the three parts, which is overall monitoring and curation, pitching journalists at high speed who covered a story, and then to isolate and determine lookalike journalists. That's incredibly valuable if you can separate those out. You're much, much more efficient than if one person or one team is doing all three parts. That's number one. Number two is identify story frequency to prioritize response types. This relates to MK's question, which is, actually, we do this at our top data agency, which is a data market research agency. We do this a lot of time for crisis communication risk. We'll assess what is the likely risk, looking at the past 5 years, that we're going to face a certain crisis so that we can prioritize and have responses for that. We can do the same thing for this. So if we go in and monitor our rapid response opportunities that in the past, let's say the past year, the ones that we didn't capitalize on, and we break those down into buckets and we say, okay, they were of type A, type B, type C, type D. Then we can look at what were the instances of those throughout the year. And then we can actually break down what's going to be most frequent or most prevalent. And this is amazing data actually to get your executive team, other stakeholders, legal on your side. Because what we actually will show is like, yeah, we've got data. We know how likely we're going to face these stories. And so let's prioritize our responses and let's pre-vet responses based on that. So that's best practice number two. Best practice number three is continually refine your media monitoring search parameters. So what happens is over time, you want to improve your signal to noise ratio. That means opportunities that you can leverage rapid response. You want to find more of those and less of the noise over time. You can do that if you're using media monitoring tools. Typically, you're doing like a Boolean search phrase, and there's false positives. There's things that don't match, particularly if you have competitors or your own company has kind of a generic name without words in. So refine those, improve those, remove the noise, and you'll identify the signal, and that will make you actually faster and better because you'll be spending less time just kind of like wading through the junk. Best practice number four deals with some of what we were talking with MK and Stephanie, which is prepare and pre-approve value-added responses. There's a lot of words in there, which is one, prepare it ahead of time, pre-approve it. So if we do that ahead of time, we know what likely we're going to face. They're kind of pre-approved, pre-vetted. And then we're looking for value-added responses. So the kind of response we want are responses that add value. So anything that we have in terms of data, white papers, content, insights, usually what we will prepare for each of those priority response areas is a few key things. We'll prepare a data point. So if this type of response opportunity comes up, we've got data ready to go. So we prepare the data point. That's type one. Two, we'll prepare an insight. So if this kind of point comes up, here's prepared insights. Three, we'll prepare a story or an anecdote. So if this comes up and we need a story or anecdote with a client or a customer or our team, we'll have that prepared. And four, we'll prepare a prediction. So if we need to extrapolate or predict, we'll of course look at the situation when it comes up, and we'll kind of know the direction our predictions are going. So just to reiterate that was data point, that was insight, that was story, and that was prediction in terms of value-added responses that can be done ahead of time. And number five, best practice is adopt a concise pitch style. Here's one thing that is actually great on two fronts, which is A good rapid response pitch is often 2, 3, maybe at most 4 sentences. It's not long. Why? Because there's breaking news. There's a lot going on. People need to understand it quickly. This isn't like, let's consider an in-depth think piece, right? We need to convey information quickly. So the good news is 2 things. 1, being concise is rewarded. And 2, you don't have to write a lot. So this doesn't have to be like, yeah, I've got to craft the perfect pitch. Better to be fast and 80% of what you could do than medium or slow and 98% of your potential in the pitch. So the concise pitch style really helps. Often this is like writing a few sentences that you can then pitch if you're doing an email, or that you can, if you get someone on the phone, or leave a voicemail, or tweet at someone, or send a LinkedIn in-mail at someone. These are all tactics we use for rapid response. Probably email is the most common. And that sort of concise, brief style is better, plus it's less work. Best practice number 6, develop and track key relationships. So one of the things you'll get a chance to do when you do this a lot is you'll start going to the same people again and again. You'll start recognizing people. And so that's an opportunity to develop a relationship. And we call it the rule of 3. And the rule of 3 is that 3 interactions, value-added interactions, where we provided that insight or that story or that data point, that's usually enough to start establishing the relationship. And that's because one example of your expertise or how you added value is a fluke, right? It can happen once. 2 examples is a coincidence. Maybe, you helped out the reporter twice. But by the time you're like, and even if they don't run the story, right? Even if it's just like you're providing insight, your value, it's on point. By the time you do it 3 times, that's a trend. And once it's a trend, not only do you want to develop the relationship with them, they want to develop the relationship with you, because you've demonstrated that trend and that you're a value-added, important person to know. And so that's a great way to develop a relationship when you don't have one. Best practice number 7, optimize in one market, then scale globally. We do campaigns and have people on the ground in 20+ countries around the world. It is great to sort of optimize this in one market, but you can do this all over. We're doing media monitoring all over the world. We're doing this in multiple languages. So don't complicate it. But if you're a multinational or global company, if you're moving into a new market, this is a powerful way to actually scale this. Is focus on one market, and you can actually scale this in multiple places. And then finally, best practice number 8, which is crowdsource feedback to improve your pitch. So the great thing about journalists is journalists have, as the cliche goes, a nose for news. They're good at understanding what the story is. They're good at understanding what's going to be interesting, relevant, or timely. They're good at understanding what questions. So as you do a rapid response and you get feedback, pay attention. Many, many times when our team has done this, like we responded to a breaking story with like our pitch, and the journalist said, well, that's interesting, but I'm actually interested in this. And it was actually a better angle than we thought up on our own. But we listen, we pay attention, we crowdsourced it, right? By going to enough journalists doing this. We're like, wow, their angle is great. Okay, let's get them answers to their angle, and then let's take that and then go pitch 20 other lookalike journalists, and then it did well. So it's like, let's do another 50, let's do another 100. It became the whole new non-rapid response, like planned PR program for the following month, just by crowdsourcing and listening. So as you do the rapid response, listen to what the journalists are saying, listen to what they're interested in, and it will make you much, much better. And then it brings me to kind of the final point of this section, and then the wrap-up point of the day, and any final questions, Jackson, which is best practice number 9, snowball successes to new media targets. So as you identify what are those stories that you're adding value to, what are those rapid response opportunities you can piggyback on, you're going to start having some successes. And then take those and snowball those to more places. An example of that is we did a rapid response for a client of ours that's a drone company, where we were responding to some kind of new developments in medicine. And one of the things that we pitched in rapid response is actually drones could be used for emergency medical applications in the future, because it might be faster to send a drone to get critical medical supplies to a sick person faster than you can send an ambulance. So we did that. Did the rapid response on that story, which resulted in a placement in the New York Times. But then we took that New York Times placement, which said like, are drones the future of emergency medicine? And then we took that and then we pitched it to all of these local media outlets, all of these local radio talk stations, all of these business journals across the country, and dozens more ran the story by snowballing that. So take your successes, use rapid response as an opportunity for rapid feedback. Then when you have a success, now it's time to scale it, and you can really transform your PR program. The other half, which is, we talked about the reactive part, the proactive part is what we call always on PR. So rapid response can give you a lot of feedback, successes that you can use on your always on PR program. And so what I'll leave you with is this point, and any final questions, Jackson, feel free to jump in, or people post your questions now. I would love to hear from them. I mean, the whole reason I do these webinars is to just like share information, share knowledge, connect with others who are interested in what we're interested in. But the final point I wanted to leave you with is that because rapid response PR can be performed all over the world in multiple languages, it is actually one of the most effective ways to introduce a brand to journalists in the new market. So we have brand launches, right? We launch brands, we launch products, we will do those kind of programs, but actually just starting to be relevant all the time, showing up in a lot of places, getting that mind share, not just share a voice. Mind share with journalists is one of the great ways to introduce an unknown brand in a market, or a well-known brand, in North America that isn't known in Europe or Asia. Doing this effectively is a great way to sort of make that brand ubiquitous, make them really relevant, and it's a great part of your brand or product or multinational launch toolkit as well. So Jackson, any final questions before I kind of wrap up with my one thing and anyone else's one thing and next steps?
Yeah, rapid fire questions for you here, Ben.
Okay, the answer is vanilla, red, and Twitterbird. No. Okay. What are the questions?
We'll see if those answers work for the questions.
Okay.
So Joyce is doing a big push right now around Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which is this month, and is something we should all be aware of. But is wondering whether you recommend it in outreach sending a conventional press release or leading with a short, sweet message first, and then sending it along additional information later. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
Sure. A couple of things. I mean, it's sort of, one, it can depend on the nature of the news, right? If you're trying to get, it doesn't have to be a press release, but if you're trying to get like, this is a story that could be covered without an interview, that just on the basis of your pitch, sometimes you want to like get more information in their hands faster. So you do a little bit more. If you have a trance and it's something that you've got to kind of like, a story that you've got to kind of like get their interest and pull them through, you might actually set up a sequence. So it's like, let's just tease it. Let's get them interested. And then let's like kind of reveal and peel out the onion. So there's that kind of, those kind of stories. In the case of breast cancer awareness month, a couple things. I mean, one, being able to dial in something that there's a lot of coverage on that topic. So something that's like interesting, newsworthy, has an angle is great. But then also really understanding what is your unique insight or approach, whatever sort of in that, hopefully, simple, surprising, and significant press release. And then monitoring coverage and rapidly responding to people covering breast cancer awareness month, which is probably done in a traditional way, with maybe that unique way that you have. So you can go out, you can pitch it to people who you've seen cover it before, but you can also see what kind of stories are breaking, and then let's respond to those, particularly those who are looking at like innovative ways to cover the story. That's an effective strategy and tactic on perennial evergreen stories like breast cancer awareness that happen every year. And by the way, a tool for this, we actually have a platform called National Today. It's at nationaltoday.com. A lot of people don't know that our agency owns the most popular holiday website and platform in the world. It's at nationaltoday.com. So check out that. It can actually be useful to leverage that to know these sort of like calendar-based marketing opportunities. Yeah, Jackson, I wasn't rapid fire enough. Vanilla, let me do better next time. What else do you got?
It's okay. Maybe we'll do one more question. I know we have a couple more, but what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just share in the chat links to your email, LinkedIn, our YouTube channel, etc. So if we don't get to your questions, then please do check out those contact details. Send along questions. We'd love to answer them offline. Maybe the final question that we can leave it off on is from MK, who's wondering what's your opinion on actually writing a story, like a contributed story for a journalist versus sort of having them write the story. And there's this thought that maybe a story is more valuable if someone else is talking about you than if you're talking about yourself, even if it's in a publication. But sometimes you kind of just need the strategic points to be right. So what's your opinion on balancing that contributed content versus content that is actually written by the journalist?
Sure. I mean, I ideally, I want both, right? Because I want the halo from their brand writing about us that kind of gives instant credibility that they said we're important. Now we get some of that by just being published in them, so we get that too. But I also love opportunities, and particularly if you can add value in a written form, you can have repeat opportunities to come back. So ideally, we structure both. And ideally, we look at the type of story that lends itself to that. And sometimes we'll pitch like, write a story on this, and they'll say, well, yeah, actually, it would be open to a submission from you. So really, it's a combination of both. What I would generally say is if we're looking at breaking news, something that's rapid response, something like that, we'd love to have them write the story because it typically gets better placement in the places it goes if they're doing it versus we're doing it. If it's thought leadership, more future looking, then sometimes those lend themselves to something that we might write. But ideally, we're kind of pitching both, and sometimes we pitch one and we get the other, and so forth. So and I would actually encourage you not only to think of written form, but also broadcast. So TV, radio, other opportunities. So sometimes we're pitching segments. Sometimes we're pitching stories. Sometimes we're writing stories. I think that's part of the PR mix that gives you kind of a rich program. So final thought of the day is a couple things. One, this is my LinkedIn. You can either shoot the QR code and it will take you right to my page, or you can write that down. I don't accept all LinkedIn requests, but I'm going to post a lot more about rapid response opportunities and possibilities and case studies. So connect with me there, and I'll accept if you say, hey, attended your webinar on rapid response, want to connect, and then we'll accept you. That's one. Two, I think Jackson's posting some slide links. I hope I have the link right there for the slides, but if not, go with what Jackson has in the chat room. Tweet at me, and the question I always want to know is, this is at Benjamin Kaplan, what is the one thing you learned today, you're going to implement, that you remember, that sticks with you? When I come to these, I always just want to walk away with one thing when I attend a webinar. So what's your one thing? I just want to know, and so I can get better too, and delve more into those one things that are important. And then finally, this is my email address. I have many different email addresses at each of our agencies. This is one that gets me pretty fast. So ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know if you want internal training, half day or full day for your team. Let me know if you're interested in potentially implementing this with us as an agency for you. Or let me know if you just want an opinion informally. I'm happy to do that too. One of our goals from this is to connect with a lot of folks doing this. And we truly believe that rapid response PR can add a tremendous value. When you react lightning quick, it just gives you a sense of confidence that you're on top of things. It feels great. It feels great when you insert yourself into a breaking story. So I encourage you to do it. And that's half of the equation. And the other half is proactive PR, reactive PR. We focused on the defense today. The offense works great too. And you put those together, and it's just magic, and you can change the entire fortunes of companies if you do this properly. So thank you to attending. Thank you to Jackson. Thank you to our team. Go pitch something fast and respond quickly today. Wish you all that kind of success, and tune in next week for the webinar where the topic will be it's the power of scalable link building, and specifically how to build links fast for SEO purposes, for PR purposes, for brand purposes. So if you want to be a link builder fast, do it 10 times faster than the normal way. Tune in next week. All right. Cheers. Thanks, everyone. Take care.